a very, very warm welcome on what is a very, very warm day. Our lecture this evening promises to be what I think is going to be a fascinating journey to one of the most remote and extreme environments on Earth. Our speaker today is someone I suspect many of you will recognise from his years as a trusted voice and face on BBC Weather, the fabulous Peter Gibbs. Before Peter became a household name forecasting the weather on BBC News and Radio 4, Peter embarked on an extraordinary adventure that I think very, very few experience, right? He spent 2 years living and working in Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey. I'm going to try not to talk too much about what you're going to talk about, Peter, but you were stationed at the Halley Research Station Centre on the Brunt Ice Shelf, and Peter braved temperatures that plunged well below minus 40 degrees, witnessed months of darkness and light, and contributed to vital meteorological research on one of the most scientifically important and physically challenging places on the planet. Today, Peter's going to share some stories from that time, the science, the solitude, the camaraderie, and the sheer wonder of the bottom of the world. So please do join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Peter. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. I've never been called fabulous before, so I'll definitely take that one. That's a good start. Okay, let's fire this up then, and we shall crack on. Yeah, so 2 years in Antarctica. I was just saying to Paul before we started, actually, when I was at school, top of the list of jobs that I wanted to do was join the Ordnance Survey. In fact, so I've always had a love of maps. I used to draw my own maps when I was a kid, and I've kept that fascination going. So I'm delighted to be addressing the British Cartographic Society this evening. You are all people after my own heart. So I thought, really, with all these map nerds, myself included, I had to start with a map, didn't I? And it's a map that shows that Antarctica really is the center of the world, the center of the oceanic world, that is. It's a beautiful projection, this. I don't know who did it. I don't know what it's called, but it really does underline the fact that we live on an oceanic planet. And I did notice this last week on social media, the National Maritime Museum has just installed this or a very, very similar map at a huge scale on the floor of their main atrium within the museum. So I'm going to have to go along and have a look at that. What it does do is really show Antarctica's importance at the center of the oceanic system, particularly the oceanic currents. It's really quite a strong driver. You could almost say the main engine in many ways of those globally important oceanic circulations. The cold, salty water that Antarctica produces, it's very dense. It sinks down into the abyssal plains, finds its way all the way up through the Atlantic in some cases, and out into the Pacific as well. At higher levels within the ocean, the Antarctic's waters are also making an impression. Part of the reason is, well, yes, because of the dense water flowing down and then becoming part of a conveyor belt that works its way around many of the ocean areas, but also it's the almost continuous storms that run around in a clockwise direction around the Southern Ocean, which is completely unobstructed by land, apart from where the Antarctic Peninsula and the tip of South America actually poke down towards each other. And so these storms just running round and round and round create a circumpolar current, which in some ways protects Antarctica from many of the things that are occurring elsewhere in the globe, but not completely, as I'll come to later on. But yes, it really is a driver of our oceanic climate and also our atmospheric climate too. And part of the way it does that is with the extension of sea ice and then contraction again on a seasonal basis. So you're seeing the the annual heartbeat here. Beautiful animation. Those pink areas, the expanding sea ice expands outwards for 1,000 miles or more from the continent during the course of the winter, doubling the amount of ice area, continent plus sea ice included, actually doubles the total surface area. And as it does that, as the sea ice forms, that's when the fresh water is taken out of the surface. The water becomes much more saline, it becomes colder, and that's what then sinks to the bottom. So that's one of those drivers that I was talking about. And then you can see as the sea ice melts again, leaving behind that cold fresh water on the surface, which again has an impact on those circulations. What that ice also does is act as a huge reflector to the sun's energy coming in from space. So at the end of the winter into the early part of spring, you've got twice the amount of reflectivity across that whole bottom part of the globe, reflecting so much energy back into space, which of course reduces with time as that sea ice gradually melts its way back to the coast. But again, you can see that this really is an important driver of what's going on, not just in Antarctica, but globally as well. So let's try and get Antarctica in scale. It's a big, big place. And I think most people really have no idea just how big it is. But if we stick it on top of continental Europe, another map, we can see that essentially it's of equivalent scale, although a much larger land area because it hasn't got all those bits missing that we have on the continental Europe map. So it's absolutely vast. It's the highest, windiest, coldest continent on Earth when you aggregate each of those parameters. There's only through the winter at most around 1,500 to 2,000 people living on the whole of that continent. Scientists primarily, support staff as well. So imagine in a place the size of Europe, you've got the equivalent number of people of a small British village. It's quite extraordinary, and living hundreds and thousands of miles apart from each other with no real way, particularly during the winter, of getting from one station to another. So the isolation is really, really intense. Even today, with modern technology, the isolation through the Antarctic winter is pretty intense. So the bit I'm going to be talking about this evening is this bit up here on the eastern side of the Weddell Sea, sitting on the Brunt Ice Shelf, which is a big floating slab of ice. I'll go into more detail about that a little bit later. Halley Research Station. And while I'm on that Antarctic map, if you're ever stumped for what the shape of Antarctica is like, you've always got a handy ready reckoner in your pocket, because if you do, let's get that right, closer to the camera. If you do that, there you go. You've got a very passable map of Antarctica right there in your hand. And we're up in that little corner there. It's a long way away. It's a long way away from the UK. And it took me a long time to get there, back in late 1979 into early 1980, which was when my big adventure began. I got on a red and white ship, the British Antarctic Survey vessel, the Bransfield as it was back then, at Southampton docks, and headed south. And 3 months later, arrived in Antarctica via stops in South America, the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, which were kind of mini adventures in their own way. But there are very definite kind of gateways or signposts as you approach Antarctica that tell you you're getting towards something very different. The first, if you remember back to that oceanic circulation map that I showed at the start, that circular circulation that goes all the way around Antarctica, the Antarctic convergence. Two different water masses are kept apart by and large by that circulation. So over the space of just a few kilometers of traveling on the ship, if you watch the sea temperature monitor, you'll see that drop several degrees over a fairly short distance. And as you cross that virtual boundary, it's an invisible boundary to the eye, of course, you start to see much more in the way of wildlife, penguins, seals, whales, and many, many, many seabirds, because the colder water, it's upwelling, it's bringing nutrients to the surface. And so there is much more feed for those animals, and they certainly take advantage of that. And then the next milestone, and it's always the biggest excitement, I think, of any voyage to Antarctica that tells you, yeah, okay, we're really going somewhere special now, is when you sight the first iceberg. These icebergs, it's really hard to get the scale. I mean, this thing was probably 200 feet high, something like that. It probably broke off from Antarctica 30 or 40 years before. These things will actually wander around in the Southern Ocean, caught up in the circulation around Antarctica, before eventually being spat out into latitudes further north, where they start to be eroded by the warmer waters, start to break up, and eventually melt completely. But yeah, 30 or 40 years is quite common for a large tabular iceberg to live its life before it finally fades away. We're still days away from Antarctica, the continent itself, at this stage. But then the next big event is when you start to meet the pack ice, the sea ice, the remnants, because you'll be going in during the latter part of spring into summer, the remnants of that pack ice that we saw expanding outwards for 1,000 miles or so from the continental edge. But that's always a thrill when you see this on the horizon. You can see it from quite a distance, actually, if there's any cloud cover. In fact, you can see just about on this picture how it's dark in the distance, the cloud, but rather lighter close to. The ice reflects light back onto the cloud. So the whiter cloud that's reflecting the ice that's ice blink. The darker cloud shows that there's open water underneath that particular bit, and that's called water sky. So navigators of old particularly used to use those features to try and look for open water to navigate their way through the pack ice. But also today, it's a really, really valuable thing for skippers to look for, to find their way through the maze of continuously shifting pack ice. And the pack ice is a really important part of the ecosystem in Antarctica. Underneath the ice, if you ever see it turned over as you go through it in the icebreaker, it's really dark and dirty underneath. That's algae that actually grows on the underside of the sea ice. That algae is eaten by krill, a type of shrimp-like creature, and that's the foundation of the food chain, which then feeds penguins, whales, and all the other explosion of animal life that you see around Antarctica. Eventually, you sight the coast of Antarctica proper. And most of the coast of Antarctica looks like this. Just an ice cliff, which can be anything from sort of 15 to 30 meters high. And bear in mind that that is only the tip of the iceberg, as it were. There'll be 9/10 of that actually below the water surface. So it's quite common for an ice shelf like this to be 150 meters thick, best part of 500 feet thick ice that's flowed off the continent. This is what the explorers of the heroic age, Scott, Shackleton, called the Great Ice Barrier, because obviously there's no way you're going to get through that in a ship. And it's remarkable to look at a picture that was taken in almost the same spot from the deck of Shackleton's Endurance on his last ill-fated expedition, of course, although it had a good outcome in the end, where the Endurance was trapped in the sea ice and sunk, and then they made the journey to Elephant Island. Look at that. It's exactly, you're seeing exactly the same thing that those people saw over 100 years ago. From that point of view, Antarctica looks entirely untouched in a place like this. So what is an ice shelf? Let's try and explain that. Antarctica is covered in a vast mass of ice, up to 4 kilometers thick in the central part of the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is the larger piece on the right hand side. The West Antarctic ice sheet over here, which includes or runs up into the peninsula. There's a large subsea trough runs through below, but that is also actually, and you can see it here, there's sea level. You can see that big trough here, which is at the moment filled with ice, but would become a sea if the ice eventually melted. But that ice is not static. It's built up over millions of years, but it's not static. It oozes out from the center like extremely thick honey and eases out from the sides, like when you put icing on a cake and it's not quite thick enough to stay there, and it just sort of oozes off the edges and runs out. And that's what creates ice shelf. If conditions are stable enough where the ice actually meets the true coast, it runs out over the sea and floats as this gigantic slab of ice. So there's no way past that, but fortunately in the vicinity of where Halley base is and has been for many decades now, since 1956 in fact, there are bays, and these bays fill up with sea ice during the winter, and much of that sea ice lingers on because it's sheltered into at least part of the summer before breaking up. And this is what allowed the establishment of the base in the first place, because ships could pull alongside, offload the stores and the personnel, and they could then be taken up onto the ice shelf. So back in January 1980, that's exactly what I did. Arrived on this ship, the Bransfield, climbed down a ladder over the side onto the ice for the first time to begin the 2-year adventure. And hopped onto a sledge a bit like this one, which was hooked up to a snowcat, a tracked vehicle, which then ran across the ice and up a large snow ramp and then up onto the surface of the ice shelf. And as I looked out from the sledge, this is basically what I saw. Just an endless flat plain of snow stretching out for tens of kilometers in every direction. Absolutely featureless, but still rather beautiful. Antarctica is not white. Antarctica is every color you can imagine, from the remarkable blues of deep, thick ice through to the sort of colors you get from the sunset, which are then reflected within the snow, and in the winter the aurora overhead as well. So it really is an absolutely magical place. So we headed out across this vast snow plain, and after about an hour or so, perhaps a little bit more, we started to see some specks in the distance, some black dots, and eventually ended up at this, which looked like just some wooden boxes on the surface, but with some gantries and lights and such like poking out of the top. But climb onto the top of this box and you'll find there's a hatch. You lift the hatch up and look down into the semi-darkness and see ladders heading off down into the belly of the ice shelf. And that was the way in, when I was there, to the base, the accommodation, everything that we needed for living in this environment for the next 2 years. So now we're getting to the tin can. You probably wondered about that title, 2 years in a tin can. Well, here it is. This is the other way into the base. So this was a long ramp to allow vehicles to be taken in and out to the garage for servicing. You can't do that on the surface, as you can imagine, with the sort of weather conditions you get. What this thing is a tube of stuff called Armco. Similar to what you see on the barriers on central reservations. It's the same sort of stuff on the motorway. It's used for, you might even walk through one, underpasses quite often, where they need a very strong underpass, or maybe to take a river or a stream through underneath an embankment. That's what this stuff actually was. So why would you use that? Well, here's a picture of what this base was like under construction. So you've got, this is the large diameter stuff that we just saw there. These are the main laboratories, workshops, living accommodation, sealed off at the end with plywood on a metal frame, and each section connected by a smaller tunnel of Armco, but a much smaller diameter. So why would you do this? Why would you go to the trouble of doing something like this? Well, it's because on the Brunt ice shelf, you get a meter or a meter plus of accumulation per year. It doesn't melt. It never melts. So anything you put on the surface of the ice shelf will gradually get buried. And as it gets buried, the pressure of snow and ice steadily increases. So this was what happened to the previous base, which we could still get access to. This was about 60 feet down. The one I was in was a little bit less. It was about 15 meters, so what, 45 feet thereabouts, 45, 50 feet down below the surface. But you can see how these were steel framed huts, big RSJs, but you'll see how they've been driven down through the partitions and even split through the pressure of the ice. So that was the reason for the new Halley 3, as this one was, having been built in that way. So here we are down inside, tin cans inside a tin can. This was one of the passageways between the main modules. And this is inside the main part of the living accommodation. So this was our lounge. Notice the picture of Princess Anne on the wall. All the British Antarctic Survey bases had a royal personage on the wall somewhere. I should say that at this stage, at this time, it was men only in all the British Antarctic Survey bases. It took several years before that policy changed, but at the time I was there, it was men only. So you can imagine 2 years looking at that picture, Princess Anne became more and more attractive by the day. But it was pretty Spartan. It really was quite Spartan. Not as warm as you might like. Sanitary arrangements left a bit to be desired. These were the deluxe toilets, 45-gallon fuel drums with the top knocked out and the toilet seat put on the top, bit of aviation fuel in the bottom, up you hop in the freezing cold. You don't hang around in there, and off you go again. Believe it or not, this was a big improvement on the previous system, which was basically a long drop toilet into a hole underneath the base, which was being formed by the wastewater from the showers and the kitchen water waste. But, you know, as happens with long drop toilets, you gradually get a build up in the middle. And of course, it being inside an ice shelf, that was a frozen tower that was gradually building up over time. And eventually it got a bit too high. So something had to be done about it. So apparently somebody would have to be lowered down into the hole with an ice axe and would actually chip away at what was commonly known as the turdicle, to clear it away so that the toilet could continue to be used. Of course, it was frozen when you were down there, but when you came out, all the chips, I'll leave the rest to your imagination. And I hope you're not eating at the moment. We could only have one shower a week because the electricity generation was a little bit subpar, so it could only melt a certain amount of snow for water. Did your washing once a week as well. So it was a bit whiffy. Or so I'm told. You got used to it, of course, but when visitors would come in the summer and open up the hatch, there was a definite Halley aroma that they were greeted with. 2 years was a long time, 2.5 years between leaving and coming back, but I absolutely enjoyed, I would say, pretty much every minute of it. And at the end of it was so institutionalized, I didn't actually want to come back. But I did come back, but then got the opportunity to go back again, something I never thought would happen 34 years later, when I was asked to do a Horizon about the work at Halley for the Horizon Science programme on the BBC, which was just fantastic. And what a different environment I found, at least the human environment. Luxury accommodation, huge it felt by comparison. Quite disorientating to be able to actually look out of a window and see the world outside. Obviously, it was more like living in a submarine in the old base. You never had any sort of daylight whatsoever down there until you went up and out of the shaft. So fantastic living and working conditions, and a pretty space age looking building as well. It's made of several modules all connected together. It's on jackable legs, so that's the way around the accumulation issue. Every year you go in, you bulldoze away the accumulated snow, you jack each leg up individually and then jack the whole thing up to the new surface level, and off you go. Not just that, it's possible to disconnect each of the modules. The legs, at the bottom of those legs, there are huge skis, and the whole thing can be moved to a new location. The reason for that is the Brunt ice shelf moves westwards at around 700 to 900 meters per year. And eventually bits break off, including the place that I spent 2 years living. This was taken, so I was there up till 82. That base was still used for another 2 years beyond that. This was taken in the mid 1990s, and it's obviously the end of one of those modules sticking out of the edge of the ice shelf. So the rest of it's gone. It's broken off and drifted away as an iceberg. And that's why having a movable base is really a very good idea. And that's already come into its own. In fact, it came into its own very, very quickly. So, because only a couple of years after the new Halley being established, this started to appear. A huge crack in the ice shelf, which was propagating by about 5 meters a day. And it was on the wrong side. The station was on the western side of this developing crack, which meant it was in danger of drifting off on a big iceberg. And I've got a lovely animation here which shows you exactly what happened. So there's the original site, the base we were just looking at. There's the site they dragged it across to, which is now known as Halley 6. And there's this crack that we just saw propagating right across that chunk of the ice shelf. You'll also notice a big lump up here going, first of all, another crack here that developed to stop any resupply by ship from any direction. So things were really not looking good, but they managed to get ahead of the curve, which was very fortunate, because it would have been a very, very expensive mistake. That iceberg, if you're wondering, is pretty enormous. There's a still of it. It's about 50 kilometers across. It's still drifting around there in the southern part of the Weddell Sea. It's about the size of Greater London, thereabouts, to give you some idea. And that's a tiddler, really, by Antarctic iceberg standards. You might ask, well, is this climate change? I'd probably answer, in this case, almost certainly not, or not a major contributing factor. This is an ice shelf doing what an ice shelf does. We've only known this ice shelf for 60, 70 years. Which is a blink of an eye for something like this, in terms of how it develops and how it how it changes over time, and perhaps the cycles that it actually goes through. So we're really still learning from that point of view. But what interests me from a mapping point of view, if I went to a satellite picture of Antarctica, I could pick out immediately the Brunt ice shelf, because it had this very distinctive sort of Roman nose shape. And now it's completely different. Something that I knew all my life has now morphed into something which looks entirely different. Now, you might wonder why it's been left as a little right angle like this. There's a very good reason for that, and it's the reason that the ice shelf is there at all. And it's a little point where the seabed actually, there's like a subsea mountain pushes up, which actually grounds the ice. So the ice is flowing from this direction off the continent. This is the subsea subsea coastline. So it's moving that direction, and then it's coming up against a bit of a stop. And this next picture will show you how that looks. So there you're seeing, over a period of a good few years, that's that little point in that top left-hand corner that the ice is running across. And there's the cracks propagating as it moves through there. But if it wasn't for that little pinning point, it's highly unlikely the Brunt ice shelf would exist at all. Notice the way down here, the ice is opening up like in a series of fingers. That is why Halley is in this position. I talked about these inlets with the snow ramps going up to the top of the ice shelf. Well, here is what one looks like on the surface. The snow's drifted in at the end here. This one actually wasn't suitable. We used to have to go and survey during the latter part of the winter to see which one was going to be suitable for the ship to come into. This one just had a really steep, almost vertical drop on it, but you had to hope that one of them would have a nice gentle ramp that things had come up. So it was the Royal Society back in 1956 that established the first base when they were looking for somewhere to set up in advance of the International Geophysical Year in 1957, and that's why Halley was chosen. Let's have a little look at the history of the area, because it does go back a long way. You saw that picture from Shackleton's Endurance. In fact, the name Coates Land dates from even earlier. That was named by the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition back in 1904, who managed to get down here and sighted this piece of land, ice. Yeah, it's it's hard to really define it, but it would have been ice that they saw. There isn't any visible land anywhere for many miles. This website is actually from the Antarctic Place Names Committee, which is a UK-based organisation that is still the responsible organisation for naming features in Antarctica, and new features are still being named almost every year, and particularly as climate change starts to change things quite dramatically, particularly in the Antarctic Peninsula. So zooming out a little bit, Caird Coast, that was a name, and Stancombe Wills, that comes from Shackleton's expedition in 1915, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, the one where the Endurance got stuck and got crushed. So we're going back a long way. He did actually map out the extent of the ice shelf and found it was a similar sort of orientation and size to what we saw from the 50s onwards. So it may be that it reduced for a time and then got back to that Shackleton type position later on. You'll notice there's some Norwegian names further east. That's because that part of Antarctica was actually named by early Norwegian explorers. It is, of course, an international continent. I thought it'd be interesting to look at, because they're the sort of bona fide names. They're the big names. There are also lots of local names that people have gradually used who lived at Halley over the years to name features. Interestingly, because they are very often ephemeral features. Those creeks change a lot over time, and yet would tend to keep the same name. They might not even be the same feature. It would be difficult to know. Gin Bottle was named because there was a piece of ice that apparently looked like an upturned gin bottle. Windy Bay, that name hung on for a good few years. It was going out of use by the time I got there. And here's a little sketch map that I actually drew, because one of my responsibilities was going and checking on what the sea ice was doing off the ice shelf. And you see there's a couple of names in there, second chip and third chip, which had carried on from probably 10 years before, and yet probably weren't even the same sort of features. So let's just quickly, to kind of round off, have a look at the southern end of the ice shelf. So this is a zone called the hinge zone. So this is the ice running off the continent, going down the slope, reaching the sea and starting to float out as it moves out here. It is called a hinge zone because the tide moves the shelf up and down. So this region here is incredibly chaotic. It's highly fractured. It's big slabs of continental ice, 500 feet thick, breaking up as it comes down the slope and gets moved up and down by the sea, and then gradually filling in again with drifted snow and sea ice forming from below as well. It's an incredible landscape, but it's quite a dynamic landscape as well. We did, in my second year, manage to find a route through, which was no mean feat, and get up onto the Antarctic plateau. So this is my furthest south photograph. It's only about 800 miles from there to the South Pole, so still quite a long way to go nonetheless. But a really, yeah, an amazing thing to do. And I say it's a dynamic landscape. This crack had actually opened up from a hairline crack to that size in the time between going up and coming back down again, in the space of less than a week. So a route that you'd found through could actually be almost impassable by the time you came back. Notice the wooden stake here. Obviously, there aren't any roads, there aren't any tracks. Your own tracks disappear the next time there's a blow and the snow drifts across it. So the only way to mark out routes is to put in markers of some sort, either 45-gallon oil drums or wooden stakes or snow stakes, as we saw here. So why is Halley there? It's there to do science. It's really important that it's been keeping records such as weather records for, well, 70 years now, thereabouts, or almost 70 years. It's a really useful record from a very, very data sparse part of the world. It's also already been vital in discovering one issue, which was the ozone hole. This is a Dobson spectrophotometer. There's the measurements from that over a period of time at Halley and other stations that showed the catastrophic decrease in ozone, which of course led to action being taken through the Montreal Protocol. Nobody knew that was going to happen. Somebody just said, I think we should measure ozone. Let's keep doing it. Oh, we've got a problem. It shows the importance of routine observation. It's also a place with the cleanest air on the planet. This is the Clean Air Laboratory, which is constantly monitoring air. Anything that you're sampling here is not going to be affected by local sources. So methane and CO2, both monitored there. This was back in 2016 when I visited. Methane values are now 1.9 something just in that period. And CO2 levels have gone from just under 400 when I was there to now 430. So it's up there somewhere. These figures for CO2 are taken from ice cores from Antarctica. Another really valuable way of extracting data that's held in this time vault of past atmospheres from these drill cores that can go back 800,000 years and show us that we really are in a very, very unusual time, moving into that unusual time. And scientists are really recognizing that. Until relatively recently, I would say, a lot of scientists, or probably the majority of scientists, thought that the impacts so far from climate change on Antarctica were relatively minor. That's now all changed. This is the Totten Glacier catchment in East Antarctica. It drains a huge area of ice. If that all ran off into the sea, then sea level would rise by about 3.5 meters. And there are signs now that the seaward end of that is being undermined by warmer water that is coming in from latitudes further north. And that seems to be the biggest threat now to the Antarctic ice sheets, not just surface melting, but melting from below as well. And so we get this quote from Tas van Ommen, scientist at the Australian Antarctic Division: almost everything we thought we knew about East Antarctica has turned out to be wrong. So Antarctica is an amazing place. Anybody who goes there, it really stays with you. But it's a very important place as well, because everything that happens in Antarctica affects all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was so interesting. What a great rare glimpse, I think, into a world few of us are ever going to experience. I have so many questions about turdicles. I really do. But it's just like, how did you decide he was going to go down and chip away at them? How was it, straws? Did you just take turns? Or?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Fortunately, it was before my time, so
okay. So you missed out.
Experience it. Yeah, it was about 3 years before they stopped doing that particular one. So yeah, that was a narrow escape. Who knows? There might be some people that quite enjoyed doing it. You know, the Antarctic night is quite long.
Yeah. I can imagine. I've got a couple of questions. If anyone wants to come off camera and unmute themselves, then feel free to raise your hand, interrupt however you think you might want to do it. That's my first question to you then, Peter, for me is, you kind of mentioned that there are things happening from a kind of climate change perspective. So there's global climate patterns. How do you think Antarctica has changed since your time there? But also, do you think people that are working there now are facing different challenges to what you might have faced when you were working there because of climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Paul, actually. The biggest changes are taking place along the Antarctic Peninsula, which I guess makes sense because that's the bit that sticks furthest north. So, you know, it's impacted by the mid-latitude storms that run around through the southern oceans, which are bringing warmer air in. The main part of Antarctica has still been relatively insulated. Halley itself, visually, not really any changes. I certainly didn't see any changes. The meteorological record is showing that temperatures do actually creep above freezing occasionally now, which they never used to do. So there is a bit of a change there. And it's certainly a bit warmer at higher levels above Halley as well. So there is warmer air at slightly higher levels, but not so much yet down at the surface. So the challenges, I think, to people at Halley are not climate related. They're more logistical related, because BAS haven't felt able to let people overwinter since the big calving event, because they just don't know enough about the stability of the ice shelf, having lost that great big chunk. We're into uncharted territory, to let people actually be there over winter when it's extremely difficult to evacuate anybody. The peninsula, on the other hand, it's causing a lot of problems. I don't know, ITV this week have had a reporter down at Rothera, which is the British Antarctic Survey base on the peninsula.
I saw that.
They've gone in middle of winter, you know, June, that is midwinter in Antarctica. There should be solid sea ice. It's open water there. They've been able to sail the ship, the Sir David Attenborough, all the way down with mostly open water there. It's absolutely extraordinary. They've seen rain in the middle of winter, and things like that do cause problems, you know, because it's mostly a dry environment unless you're right on the northern tip. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the most rapidly warming parts of the planet. It's risen something like 3.5 to 4 degrees. So the changes there are major.
Yeah.
Stuff's melting fast.
That's incredible. There are a few questions popping up in the chat, so let's try and grab some of them. Someone's put, what kind of qualification did you need to go, and did you need any training?
Yeah, okay. Qualification wise, I did a physics and geography degree, so meteorology was quite a good fit. I was the designated meteorologist at Halley for the 2 years there. To be honest, I wanted a bit of adventure. You know, I'd always been somebody that loved the outdoors. I had read all the books of the heroic era, the Scott and Shackleton stuff. I was quite attracted by that. I was fairly adventurous. I used to go caving and climbing, and I grew up in the Lake District. So this just felt like a good opportunity. You know, before I got into any sort of commitments out of university, a fairly free agent. Let's give this a go. So that was my driver. Training wise, yes, I got training on using and maintaining the instruments. A bit of training on I mean, I knew a reasonable amount already, but stuff like crevasse rescue, that type of thing. Interestingly, there didn't appear to be any sort of psychological testing or training. You know, you can imagine you're living with 15 other people in a tin can, completely isolated for 9 months of the year, 3.5 months of that in total darkness in the winter when you hardly go outside. You need to have a fairly stable personality for that to work. And in fact, I don't know if anybody saw the news recently at the South African station. There was a really nasty situation where somebody did turn a bit unstable and was threatening to shoot the station commander. I mean, that's absolutely terrifying in a location where you have absolutely no escape. We never had anything approaching that. You got on each other's nerves in the winter with being cooped up like that. But I just think BAS were very good with lots of experience of actually just spotting people who would actually gel in that sort of environment.
Thanks, Peter. That's really interesting. Couple more. Charlie, apologies if I get this question wrong, but he's put, what data was used to see the waves of the ice pushing around the mountain / uplift?
Right,
how
yes.
was it processed to be able to see the waves?
Yeah, good question. It's radar data from the Copernicus system. I'm trying to think of the actual satellites. It's one of the polar orbiters run by the European Space Agency as part of the Copernicus setup. And it's somebody at Leeds University, Adrian Luckman. If you search for Adrian Luckman, you'll find, I don't know if it'll be on a website, but I found those on social media. I've conversed with them a bit on Twitter and Blue Sky, so I grabbed them from there, from his site. But yeah, that's radar data. So obviously you can still get pictures through the darkness of winter and through cloud as well. So that's why we end up with those fantastic animations.
I see. One last question in the chat from Mr. Goldsmith. How did you communicate with family and friends back in the UK during your 2-year tour?
Yeah, with great difficulty, actually. There was no satellite comms back then, so it was all just shortwave radio, which had to be via a relay station in the Falkland Islands, run by Cable and Wireless, because we were under the auroral zone, which really messes up communications, particularly during the winter, because it buggers up the ionosphere, which is what you're bouncing your radio signals off. So voice was extremely difficult. Most of it was teleprinter communications, which is more robust if you haven't got a great signal. So it's basically teleprinter into Stanley, and then they relayed it back to the UK. We were allowed a 200-word telex message once a month, in and out. So basically one text message a month, in and out, to family and friends. But to be honest, I ran out of things to say after a while, because it's such a sort of routine existence, and it's such a completely different existence to what anybody else is experiencing, that you kind of don't know what to do. The other time we would get communications was during the summer. We'd usually get an aircraft in around about end of October, November time. And that would usually bring some letters in from home. And then the ship would come in at some point, usually around January time, to resupply the base with a whole year's supplies, of course, because it was only coming once. And then you'd get more letters, and you'd get parcels from home, and you'd be able to send stuff back out on that. But yeah, obviously a bit of a a bit of a lag, a kind of 9-month delay loop in any sort of communications back and forth by letter. But it was quite special, actually. When those letters came in, people would just sort of disappear off to a quiet corner and just kind of take it in, and each have their own quiet time and their own quiet space. Yeah, you got out of your bubble just for a little while, and
Yeah,
had to
yeah, yeah. I can
think a
imagine.
bit differently.
So
Yeah.
your message didn't start with what the weather was doing. It's still cold.
It's cold.
Another couple of questions have popped in, if you're okay, Peter, for
Yeah,
time.
definitely. Yeah.
Vivian Godfrey has put, is each person expected to be an expert in a certain field, and what were the key areas of expertise?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. It was when I was there, it was pretty much a 50-50 mix between scientists, and we were pretty much all just new graduates. And I mean, called support staff. It sort of underrates what they actually did do. So it's people like carpenter, electrician, diesel mechanic, vehicle mechanic, who basically kept everything running on the base. They were our life support system. We chipped in with all the manual work as well. Everybody just did everything. I say scientists, we were actually just observational scientists. So we were just keeping the observational record going. Meteorology, so measuring temperature, humidity, snow depth, etc. Sent a balloon up once a day to measure profile through the atmosphere. There were people looking after the magnetics, so it's a magnetic observatory as well, so observing changes in the Earth's magnetic field, which was very interesting around the time of auroras. VLF observations, very low frequency waves, which tell you a lot about what the upper atmosphere is doing. Ionospheric measurements as well. There was an incredible machine that was all sort of cogs and bicycle chains that used to send radio waves up and bounce them back off the ionosphere to get a measure of where the ionosphere was and what it was doing at what sort of levels. So that they were the main sort of areas of expertise. So they were just looking for people who had a bit of an understanding of the instrumentation and so on, but who could be relied upon to do good quality routine observation. Now it's very different. Most of the stuff's automated. Halley actually runs all the experiments, and the observation programs all run automatically through 9 months of the year when people aren't there. they have a small turbine generator that runs without any maintenance for that length of time to keep everything powered up. They can obviously interrogate the data remotely via satellite link. And so the people that do go in are mostly technical expertise. So it's people with computing experience, with electronics experience, radio experience to maintain and set up that sort of equipment. But still, you know, cooks, electricians, etc., all the trades as well, a hugely important part of the mix.
Wow, incredible to hear just how many people were needed, but less so now due to being able to automate a lot of it through machines and whatnot. Yeah, really interesting. Just to finish, one last question, which kind of ties in a little bit to a question I had. I was interested to know what it's like there at Christmas, but Trevor's also asked, what did you do during your downtime?
Okay, yeah. Well, Christmas used to not really figure very much because it's right in the middle of summer. It's the busiest time. Quite often you would actually get the ship coming in over the Christmas period. So it was all hands on deck just to get the new lot of supplies in. Because if the weather broke, you know, you might lose several days. You might lose the sea ice that the ship is actually alongside. And that did happen once or twice. I've actually walked out to the ship when there was a storm brewing up, a swell coming in, walking across the sea ice, and it was doing that. You could actually see it doing that in front of you, which was not a great experience. So Christmas wasn't really a big deal. Midwinter, however, is a big deal. So that's the Antarctic Christmas essentially. So 21st of June, we would stop all non-essential work for a whole week. Everybody have a week off, and we'd create our own entertainment. And a lot of it, you know, is just exactly the same sort of things that you read about that they did at Midwinter in Scott and Shackleton's time. So things like making a Midwinter magazine with all sorts of in jokes and, you know, poems and photographs and stuff like that. Putting on a show, maybe, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's that was a more particular. Oh, and making midwinter presents for each other as well. So you'd spend the time leading up to that, making a present that you'd. It's like a bit like Secret Santa, but you had to actually make the stuff yourself rather than going down to Argos or whatever to actually buy something. Downtime, there wasn't a huge amount of downtime because the observation programs took a lot of doing, and the base, because it was so old and in a bit of a state and coming towards the end of its life, required a lot of work to keep it livable as well. Things like chipping the ice away from outside of those tubes. So actually going into, you know, creating a void and going into there and chipping the ice out to try and reduce the pressure so that the huts wouldn't get crushed inside, so they could just eke out another year or two of life from the station. Every week you'd have gash night on a Friday, which is the base clean from top to bottom, something that comes from the Navy tradition originally. Base clean from top to bottom, all the rubbish got out, dumped on the ice, set fire to. It's every single thing is brought out now, of course, because you don't want to leave anything behind. And then a sit down meal where everybody had to dress up. That was the one time of the week where everybody had to actually just be a bit more civilized, you know, get out of their old work clothes, get into something a bit more, just to have a little sense of normality. I used to go running. I used to enjoy that. I used to go skiing, cross-country skiing. I absolutely loved just getting away from the base on my own in that environment, completely away from the sight and the sound of the base. So it's just me and Antarctica. And I tell you what, it's almost spiritual. And it just gives you such a sense of insignificance, which I think is quite a healthy experience to feel sometimes for everybody. So yeah, I mean, other than that, we didn't have video wasn't a thing then, so we used to have films brought in. About a dozen films would be brought in, which we'd watch endlessly and probably recite some of them still even now. We had a load of records that had been brought in from the Falkland Islands years before. It was all old Radio 4 stuff, or home services it was. So things like the Goons and Round the Horn and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, and you just had to make your own entertainment, basically.
So, sorry, I've got another question then. But when you
Yeah.
went running, I'm just thinking from a safety perspective, you're going running on your own. Yeah. Back then, was there any way of, like, you know,
you had to sign out and sign back in again.
Okay.
And tell somebody you were going out.
Yeah.
And an approximate time you'd expect to be back, so somebody would check.
Right. Okay.
And you'd say where you were going. I'll be honest, health and safety back in the early 80s.
I can imagine.
wasn't a big thing. That was one of the amazing changes I saw when I went back in 2016. I could not believe, you know, how much the sort of safety ethos had changed. Absolutely for the better, because there are an awful lot of ways to die in Antarctica. It's a dangerous place.
Yeah, I can believe it. Look, Peter, there's loads of love for you and your talk in the chat. So thank you so much for taking the time this evening to come along and talk to us. I think we've all found it really, really interesting, but also really, really fascinating. It's a great insight into, like I said earlier, a world that probably all of us will never get to experience. So thank you so much for doing that. I know there were a lot of people as well that couldn't make it, so thank you for allowing us to record it so that
not at all. No, that's
they can see it too. So yeah, just a massive thank you, Peter. And look, if you want to come to Ordnance Survey for a visit, Jim and I can definitely arrange that.
That sounds good. Yeah, it's not far down the road. You're still in Basingstoke, aren't you?
No, we're Southampton. So yeah.
Southampton. Right. See, I'm way behind the times, aren't I?
You'd be more
than arrange that.
I'd love that. I'd absolutely love it.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I like talking about Antarctica, as you can probably see.